I'll be clear, I'm not exactly respected when it comes to where I work. I work in a shady sort of place, the kind of investigation duty that pays employees to stay quiet about all of the specifics. I can say we investigate the stuff the police would normally leave alone, because it's just too goddamn strange that I will say my managers will take literally any opportunity to pinch me. I'd be off the main investigation team if it weren't for the insistence of my coworkers, but despite my distinction and recommendation of my team, that still didn't mean management liked me. Me and one of my colleges were injured on the last assignment, though I'm not allowed to go too far into it. But while I was granted a hideously deep gash in my side, the most Glenn walked away with was a sprained wrist and a few deep bruises. I was put out of commission for a while, and recovery time felt much slower than it actually was. I won't say that was the first time I'd been injured like this, but I will say it was one of the worst. I counted Gwen lucky that she could head back into work so soon despite the brace on her wrist. Not like I could blame her though, I was being reckless and these things happen, but it still put me in a bad mood because it meant management wasn't going to let me back in the field for even longer. They did this to me whenever they could, so I wasn't too surprised when this happened, though I will admit I was pissed. Being in almost peak condition, doctors said it would be fine so long as I didn't exert myself too much. Management must have interpreted that as a chance to set me on the most mind-numbing and unimportant tasks they could find. They tried to get me into paperwork, which I did begrudgingly, but they already had a department for that and they were managing just fine. I tried asking if I could contribute to the main team via research or information gathering, but they shut that down fast. Instead, I was charged with reviewing a section of video footage that had been delivered anonymously. Strange, right? But this sort of thing had happened a few times before. Most of the time either a thank you from a client or takes from people trying to give a bad name by sending edited video footage. It had been annoying, the latter I mean, nobody likes a dead scent from attention seekers and most of the time it was pretty obvious from the outset. Nevertheless, it was still part of our policy to review all mail sent in, and seeing as management was looking for something for me to do, guess who was lucky enough to analyze the latest box of tapes sent in? I'd signed up to the night shift a few nights early on in my career, not like I sleep well anyway, so I may as well make use of my time. This was one of those days. I was set up at a small room, one with a few TV screens that looked pretty old. It was a messy kind of room, like an old, converted storage space, with lots of scattered papers and shelves of records, tapes and supplies in labeled cardboard boxes. I was curious of why I'd been moved, but my manager had just handed me a fairly heavy box of VHS tapes. Made sense, since there weren't many devices that could play these in the building. Sighing, I sat down on the chair and started the first few files. It was clear early on that the recordings had no sound. They had the kind of black and white security measure quality that you would expect, though quality was bad and things got fuzzy and cut out in the start, though I assumed this had something more to do with the system than the tapes themselves. The first was a recording of a forest, not especially anything interesting, because not much seemed to happen. I skipped several hours of the recording, still nothing. I stopped a few times to watch in real time, just to make sure I wasn't missing too much. According to the timestamp, I'd skipped a few days by now. A few more recordings were like this, nothing happened. Maybe an animal would walk by if I was lucky, but other than grainy trees moving in the wind there was nothing. I'd considered many times just doing something else instead and lying to my superiors about finishing the tapes, but I knew this was the most of a break I was going to get and it would look suspicious if I'd finished reviewing all these tapes so soon. I knew I'd be bored though, so despite the implications, I'd let it run on in the background and keep a half eye on it while I checked out some other things on my laptop. I made some doodles, read a few articles on the supernatural, because I find it interesting even outside of my job. I got a call partway through this, having left the recordings on real time so I could monitor it more easily while I did whatever to pass the time. It was one of my teammates, Luke. He usually led the team and like, with the others I was good friends with him. He was just checking up on me to see how I was doing and getting my opinions on the case they were working on. I did as he asked, confirmed a few facts with him against my manager's orders. The rest of the team sent their hellos and everything, so that was cool. Eventually the conversation drifted back to what I was doing. So, reviewing tapes, huh? He said. It almost sounded like he was smirking. Yeah, box wasn't even labeled, not even a note. Well, way to waste your time, I'm sure. Yeah, just full of VHS tapes. They had to move me to a back room to check them out. Is there anything else in the box? I don't know. Didn't really check it out. All of the footage is just a shot of the forest, not even any abnormal activity. Weird. So what happens if you find anything? Well, I was told to just pass it on to you guys, but don't think something on the screen caught my eye. I'd spoken too soon. Nix? You there? What happened? I didn't respond to Luke right away. I put the phone back on the desk and rewound the tape to the spot it had seen it. Two guys had walked onto frame, then the recording cut out for half a second. When it came back up again, the two people were hanging from thick tree branches, tied up from their wrists, and if they weren't dead they'd be soon. I was taken aback by just how abrupt this was. I paused it and tried to make a mental list of the injuries I'd seen on the two men. It was far, far too many to have been done in that half-second time frame that the clock had suggested. My mouth went dry. Nix, what's going on? Luke's shouts broke me from my daze. Well, I was just proven wrong big time. Two people just wandered on screen, then after half a second of cutout they're both dead. Creepy, and you're sure that this isn't just a prank or something? He was right. There were a whole host of people who didn't take our department seriously, so I couldn't rule that out yet, but something told me there was more to it than that. I don't know, I admitted it. It looks a bit too real, but there's always editing. It'd be harder to check with them being tape recordings. That's true. How far in are you? Fifth tape, but there's about 15 here, so it's going to be a long night. Okay, I'll have to leave it to you for now. Hopefully you'll be able to investigate it with us. He hung up. Wouldn't count on it, I muttered grimly to myself, turning my attention back to the tapes. I wrote down what I'd seen, making sure to include the details of which tape it was and the time frame of what I'd seen, along with the tape numbers. I rewound them a few times, and then I noticed something in some of the earlier frames. Two of the trees had changed places between the tapes, and I was surprised and a little angry at myself that I'd not noticed it earlier. I'd thought the camera might have just been moved, but every other detail had remained exactly the same. Somehow, those two trees had slowly edged their way across the back of the frame without my noticing, but as I kept looking, nothing else seemed to be out of the ordinary, aside from the murders I mean. I got some string and a few labels from the storage boxes around me, then I wound the 5 tapes together and labeled the one with the murders. Then I taped my notes onto the top, for good measure, and placed them in an empty box I'd found. I then turned back to the box. 10 more tapes to go, at least, if something else wasn't in the box. I put in the next 5 tapes. It looked to be shot in a secluded area. There were stairwells on one side and a few empty corners, with the buildings themselves made of brick. Then, on the other side, was a wired fence, with long grass growing on the outside. As before, nothing too significant happened. The first 4 tapes looked to just be as empty as the other ones, but I knew what I was looking for. I scanned every inch of those tapes, switching back and forth as dead leaves fluttered in and out. Unlike the first 5 tapes, however, none of tapes 6, 9 had anything moving like those trees. Instead, a kind of black ink scribble fluttered in and out on one of the bricks in the far corner, and in tape 10, to my horror, a girl fell from the top stairwell off screen and blood pooled around her head on the concrete. It was clear she was dead. Admittedly, I was desensitized to it, but the action was shocking. Even more so as a second went to inspect the body, probably a friend of the victim, and seemed to look directly into the camera before screaming in terror before it cut out. Needless to say, creepy as fuck, and definitely something the police would get involved in. Though the tape was done, but apparently there was still 5 minutes left, so I waited patiently as the feed went back on. The people were gone, but a kind of creature walked on, sniffing at the camera. It was a deep navy blue color. Looked like a kind of big cat or leaner wolf, with a tail that just didn't fit either of them. The tail in question wrapped around the lens, partially blocking out the screen as it lifted up the camera. Something snapped and it abruptly disappeared, dropping the camera as it went. I was taken aback, but repeated what I did with the first few takes. I took notes, found the takes and put a label on take 10. Then I placed it in the box with the other stack and turned to investigate takes 11, 15. I will never forget what I'd seen in those takes. Like the other stacks of takes, which seemed to be collected in stacks of 5. I started up take 11, and like the other two stacks, it took place in another separate location. This one, on a fairly suburban street with a few cars and a van lining the street. I think I might have passed it a few times in the past, but that's beside the point. The van looked like the same one we'd use on field missions, so needless to say I was confused and concerned. So far I'd witnessed 3 deaths in these takes, possibly 4. I still had no idea how this footage was even collected or how the person had known what was going on. It might not have been the first time stuff like this had happened. I looked on nervously as a figure exited the vehicle. It looked like Tobias, and I frowned at the observation. He walked inside a nearby house, one I figured was his. And unlike the other takes, which took place in very secluded spots, with 2 people max, there were quite a few people here. Each one ducking in or out of the houses on the street with a few cars going past. However, this time the small changes in the surroundings were more obvious. All of the streetlights in the area were flickering. It was so unnerving. I kept my eye on the screen, tracking every movement I could. I hadn't realized how invested I was in this now mystery. I kept thinking I should just skip to take 15, but in hindsight I'm glad I didn't. Takes 13 and 14 a man was standing in the middle of the road. A few cars came and ran straight through the figure on the street, facing the camera. One of them stopped in front of the guy, before getting out to try to reason with the guy. He didn't respond, or even move. I was scared for the driver, but eventually they just got back in their car and went around him. I stared in fascination at the guy. The lights were still flickering. He turned on or lit some kind of light in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was though. He waved it a few times. It was entrancing, if I'm being honest, but at the same time it had me on the edge of my seat. I could tell something bad was going to happen. I took it out once it was done. The guy was still in frame as the tape ended. I put in take 15. It looked like it was shaking. The kind of shaking you see if someone was running with a camera, which was very strange when considering what type of camera it would have taken to shoot this. Whoever was running with it was headed towards a rundown house, passing the other houses and cars from the previous recordings. The house, well, it looked about as abandoned as it gets. Overgrown, paint peeling, with rusted metal gutters and corrugated iron. Whoever was carrying the camera jumped the fence, bursting towards the door before the camera slipped from their hand and tumbled into the dirt and brush below. I felt sick as the disorienting image flashed. I'd never fancied this kind of shaky filming, for more reasons than one. It came to a stop, and things were upside down. I tried to turn my head a little, but that went as well as you would expect. What was most concerning was that after another half-second cutout of static, I saw a bloodied hand appear lying on the dirt with the rest of the figure just off screen. That wasn't the worst of it. I could make out a hole in the wooden boards that ran around the bottom of the house. It looked to be blocking off the underneath of the house, but you'd expect that in a house like this. A panel had been moved, but there was still a hole. Somehow, the camera moved into it, surprisingly stable. To this day I have no idea how that's possible, but given the nature of this job I've encountered weirder stuff. It got dragged into the hole that led to the underside of the house. After a few long minutes of being dragged through complete darkness, I saw the far part of the crawl space. Like before, it was blocked off with a few holes and stuff between the boards. You could see a flickering light on the other side, and I sat there waiting for something to happen next. Aside from the thin slits of light through the boards, there was nothing else to find. The recording cut out. I hesitated in writing down what I had seen. In a few dot points I described the guy, tried to label takes 13, 14 and 15 before finding the stack and placing them in the box with the others. I sat back and had to take a breath. This was so many levels of creepy and unexplainable. I'd have to notify management of what I'd found, Luke too, and definitely Tobias. Despite the light being on in the room, illuminated in full, I still felt shivers run up my spine. I researched for another few hours, catching the address of the places and looking them up. I took pictures of the screen and put them in the box with the tapes. I didn't like this, not one bit. But be that as it may, for the first time I'd counted myself lucky that I'd been held back. Then again, I'd be more than happy to get back out there and look into this myself. In fact, I doubt even management could keep me away from those places after a hook like that. I gave Luke another call. It immediately went on voicemail. I tried 3 more times, and my gut sank. Then I tried Gwen, then Tobias, then Courtney and Michael. Nothing, and I cursed my luck. It wasn't unordinary, especially if they were away doing something for work. Cursing my luck, I walked to the main office to find, well, someone on any of the teams, main or not. No one was here, and that was not normal. At least 10 other people did the night shift with me, and if not then at least the janitors should be here about now. This was just crazy. I turned to go to the manager's desk to drop off the box. I left a note explaining what I had found and hoping to God that I'd be clear by then. I walked out, preparing to just get my stuff and lock up the facility as those tapes were my last task for the day, and frankly, I think I may have worked overtime on it. But, as I opened the door to leave the office, I noticed 3 pictures pinned on the wall, and I froze. They were undeniably the exact same places as those seen in the tapes, but that couldn't be right. Nobody else had seen anything on the tapes before I did. Management had confirmed it, so it must have meant they were a separate investigation. I checked the notes and dates on each. Nothing about a murder on any of them, but all 3 were separate cases that had been planned on being investigated as part of an ongoing investigation that management hadn't consulted any of us about. No details besides that though, other than the dates, which took place a few months earlier than the timestamps on the footage I'd just seen. What took me most by surprise though, was no one but the manager, as far as I could tell, was investigating this. What exactly were they keeping from us?